Professor Emeritus Gordon Bjork joined CMC in 1975 and retired in 2003. During his time, he became the John B. Lovelace Professor of Economics. He also founded the PPE program, which happened to be my major, although I did not get to have Gordon Bjork because I had the econs portion a couple of years after he departed. He currently resides in Santa Barbara, and he frequently returns for Alumni Weekend and the numerous programs that we have in Santa Barbara. After he retired, a group of alumni led by Pablo Nathan, who is on here, were so kind to help coordinate an endowed chair in honor of Professor Gordon Bjork. Professor Bjork will be talking about the American Dream, a follow-up, so to speak, from Professor Roth's talk a few months ago. Professor Bjork, the floor is yours. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Have I got everything right on my screen, Evan?
You look good.
Okay. Well, 80 years ago, in his inauguration as president in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said, "These are no ordinary times." And these are no ordinary times for all of us. And it's my inaugural lecture on Zoom, my first experience as a speaker. So let's hope it works. Thanks to Evan and Jenna for organizing it. Let's hope the winds don't blow down the power lines in Southern California like they have in much of the Bay Area. I have very happy memories of many meetings with alumni during the time I was at CMC and even after retired. I think I was at alumni chapter meetings over most of the United States. And I remember after I retired doing alumni chapter meetings in London and Singapore. But at any event, bear with me as I do my inaugural lecture. My topic is the American Dream. And as a précis of the lecture, I'm going to concentrate only on its economic aspects, what's happened to real income, and what's happened to opportunity in the American economy over the last half century. I was born in the depths of the Great Depression, 1935. A quarter of the labor force was out of work. My father was out of work. I was born when my parents were living in a borrowed shack. It was not the American dream, it was the American nightmare. But a year later, my father found employment again. 2 years later, they moved into a rented house. 3 years later, they bought their own house. They experienced rising real incomes during their lifetime. I had a happy childhood. I graduated from from high school in 1953. The year that I graduated, the Korean War ended. One of my high school buddies, a year older than me, came back from the Yalu River without his toes. And I was very thankful that I was too young to serve in the Korean War and later too old to serve in the Vietnam War. One of my high school girlfriends pointed out that if we didn't go to college, we could get married and buy a home. And 3/4 of our classmates did that. But I did go to college. And 30 years later, I was an assistant professor, not 30 years from high school graduation, but from birth. I was a young assistant professor at Columbia University in New York. I'd gone from the borrowed shack to an apartment on Riverside Drive. It was a very prosperous time, but a tense time in the United States. When he was inaugurated, John Kennedy said that we were starting a new frontier, an illusion to the American dream. And in 1965, President Johnson said we were going to have a war on poverty. We were going to eliminate poverty, and we were going to have a great society with Medicare and Medicaid and expanded Social Security. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 started affirmative action. The courts were desegregating the public schools that had not been segregated by the Supreme Court decision 10 years before. It was a hopeful time in America. A half century on, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security have virtually eliminated poverty for older Americans. But unfortunately, there's a lot of poverty for the young. Social mobility has declined. It is more difficult for people to work their way up from the lower quintiles of the population into the other. Affirmative action has changed employment practices and has still left large differences in outcomes for various identity groups. Some Americans fear that they will not share in the American dream, and some Americans fear that it's going to be taken from them. They marched on the Capitol 2 weeks ago. Our nation was founded on a political philosophy called by one political theorist, C.B. McPherson, possessive individualism. Possessive individualism said that men had a self-evident right to life, liberty, and property, and private property and economic freedom were defined in terms of private ownership and markets, which were structured and defined and protected by the government. When the Great Society was announced, I was an assistant professor at Columbia teaching a course on the social framework of American business. My first book after my doctoral dissertation, Life, Liberty, and Property, the Development of the American Capitalism, 1970, came out of that course. I could have entitled it The Way It Worked, period, rather than The Way It Worked and Why It Won't. That book got a lot of attention. There's the Thai version, the Brazilian version, the Spanish version, the South Asian version, but I never talked about it very much when I was at CMC. The book attempted a reinterpretation of possessive individualism in terms of a social contract. The terms of exchange in markets might benefit the richer parties more than the poorer, but they would be accepted by the poorer parties if poorer parties were better off and the richer parties contributed more to society than they took for themselves. The argument used the elements of microeconomic theory, utility curves, production functions, indifference curves, Edgeworth boxes, Pareto optima. All of you alums remember all of those from Econ 101, I'm sure. The limiting conditions were that income distribution had to become more equal as per capita incomes increased, and that the Lockean proviso for the American dream had to be present. My version of the American dream it was a fair deal. My book tried to explain how the incentives and constraints of our social contract had been important in the achievement of the economic growth part of the American dream. The book had historical estimates of income growth and income equality in the United States. During the time I was writing the book, I worked on a committee of Columbia faculty to prepare testimony for Martin Luther King to give before the Riverkoff Commission on urban poverty in the United States, which had been instituted because of all of the riots in American cities in the decade. The evidence showed that there were large differences in income and wealth for Blacks. That was before we called them African Americans. The evidence indicated that US per capita incomes increased between 1870 and 1930, but that income equality decreased during that period. But the evidence also showed that between 1930 and 1965, when my data ended, that incomes had increased rapidly, per capita incomes, and income equality had increased as well. The American dream and the fair deal were working. The primary factors increasing the equality of income of the total population in the 1930 to 1965 were, number one, the increase in the share of national income going to labor as opposed to capital, and the increasing equality of wage income. I expressed the hope that those trends would continue. They haven't. I expressed the hope that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and affirmative action would start to remedy racial inequality in labor markets. They've made some difference. Real wages for the lower half of the working population have improved relatively little over the last century, but significantly, most of the improvement in the standard of living of the bottom half of the income distribution has come from transfer programs, expanded Social Security, Medicaid, rent subsidies, food stamps, earned income tax credits. The American dream is no longer earned by wages by a substantial part of the population from their income from work, but an increase in their transfer incomes from the rest of society. We have become a social democratic economy along the lines of the social democracies of the European Union. In 1980, we had the election between Reagan and Carter. I didn't think I liked Jimmy Carter's malaise in America. I shared George H.W. Bush's view that supply side economics were voodoo economics. But Reagan was elected, and a number of my CMC colleagues went to Washington to help in the supply side economics of the Reagan Revolution. I stayed at Claremont, worked on bank sim and some other computer simulations in economics, started PPE, did some research on real estate economics, and had several visiting professorships. In 1990, I started work on my last book, The Way It Worked and Why It Won't: Structural Change and the Slowdown of Economic Growth. The alumni offices put in a plug for it. The hardcover is now pretty expensive, but you can get both the hardcover and the used in and the softcover in used editions. But the best way, if you want to get the book, is to do it on Kindle, and you get all of the conclusions and organization of the book and the free sample that they offer you. So I'm not trying to plug my book. The underlying economics of Reagan's morning in America were that tax cuts and deregulation would unleash productivity change, and that cuts in marginal tax rates would increase participation rates. And that that was the way that morning in America would be realized. My book addressed the question initially looking at the effect of tax cuts on participation rates. They slightly increased participation rates for married women in the top half of the income distribution. But then I expanded it to the whole program. The underlying economics were that you would get an increase in participation and an increase in productivity. For years, I subjected my CMC students to the data. In PPE, I assigned several papers with the title, "Where is Bjork Wrong on the Theory or the Evidence?" Economic growth depends on growth in per capita incomes, It depends on two components. One, labor productivity, and two, participation rate of the population in the labor force. From this aggregation of a century of data, I became aware that the rate of productivity was affected substantially by shifts in output from sector to sector, from agriculture, mining, and construction to manufacturing, public utilities, and transportation. And then at the end of the decade, to financial services and education and government. Productivity increased unevenly depending upon the capital intensity of the sector. But it was accelerated in the 50s and 60s by the movement of people from sector to sector. As an example, when a worker left chopping cotton in Mississippi to bang bolts on the assembly lines in Detroit, their measured productivity increased tenfold in the course of a year. To sum up the evidence on productivity growth, the growth varied from decade to decade because of differences in intersectoral rates of growth of productivity and shifts. And it slowed down in the 80s and 90s, and I haven't done the data since 2000 because so much output, so much employment shifted to sectors of the economy, particularly healthcare and education, where you can't value the output of student FTEs per year or hospital beds occupied because you don't put a price on them, a value on them. Productivity slowed down. The second powerful contributor to economic growth was demographic change. A movement of working age women from household work to the market labor force, and then the change in the age structure of the population. Could supply side economics bring morning to America? Can economic growth be accelerated? No. When workers have shifted from lower to higher productivity sectors, they can't shift again. And the participation rate of the population has fallen since 2000 because of changes in age structure, and would have fallen more if older people had been able to afford to retire. Some measurement conventions. The rate of growth of per capita income is the sum of the rate of growth in productivity and the rate of growth of the participation rate. As an example, if productivity goes from 50 to 51,000 per year, that's a 2% increase in productivity. If the participation rate goes from 50% to 51%, that's a 2% increase in participation. 2 plus 2 equals 4. You would have a 4% increase in per capita income from the combined effects of productivity growth and increases in participation. The participation rate of women and the total labor force increased until 2000, and then it stopped increasing. And if you combine a positive productivity growth rate with a negative growth rate in participation, it lowers per capita income growth. The good news about an economy like ours, which is mature, is that it is rich. The bad news is it's hard to get richer. And the basis of my argument in the way it worked and why it won't is that the American dream is not a perpetual motion machine. But there's an even greater challenge. Participating in the Great Society requires more and more years of education. When I was a freshman at an Ivy League college in 1953, I could have earned my yearly tuition with 800 hours of work at the minimum wage. In 2021, it would take a CMC freshman 5,000 hours of work, 6 times as much to earn their tuition. The share of national income spent on education has gone from 2% to 10% of GDP over the last century. The Great Society finances longer lives. A century ago, people worked from 15 to 55 and then they died. Now they hope to work from 25 to 55 and retire for 30 years on the same standard of living. If you look at the appendix to my book for simulations of what it requires for savings and rates of return on pension plans to fund 30 years of retirement from 30 years of work, you'll see that the traditional numbers won't work. And then there is Medicare and Medicaid. One of my grandparents died in his 40s. Two of my grandmothers died in their 50s in our home because it was before Medicare and there was no money to pay for them. My parents both had their medical expenses and taken care of by Medicare during their retirement. Because the cost of Medicare, of medical treatment has spiraled over the years, we've gone from 5% of GDP to almost 20% of GDP in health services. So the bad part of the Great Society is more and more of the costs of education and medical care are tax transferred from the working population to the young and old dependent population for their retirement and medical care. In the state of California, an increasing share of the state's tax income is going to fund Medi-Cal, and a decreasing proportion is going to fund education. The last time I looked at the numbers, the state was spending about $12,000 per student in K through 12 education and about $100,000 per year for people in nursing homes on Medi-Cal. Let's now return to the other component of the American dream, equal opportunity. The fundamental requirement to participate in an advanced industrial society is education. The 19th century dream of opportunity was land. Anybody could acquire land on the frontier. Horace Greeley told people to go west, young man. In the 20th century, it's been based on the opportunity for every citizen to acquire an education that would equip them for a good job and a good income. It hasn't. A couple of labor economists, Golden and Katz, noted in The Race Between Education and Technology 2010 that the American labor force in the 20th century has been in a race between education and technology. And up until about 1980, education was winning. It's no longer winning. Apart from quality issues, the high school graduation rate peaked in 1979 and then declined until the last decade. In 1979, the high school graduation rate in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit was 25%. How are you going to run an advanced industrial society when 3/4 of the labor force doesn't have a high school education? So where are we in conclusion on the American dream? Our current social turmoil reflects in part the view that half of our society is not achieving the American dream, and a view by the other half that the governing elites want to implement programs that will take the American dream away from them. When the economic pie stops growing, conflict over shares intensifies. I still hope for the American dream for our 4 children and 8 grandchildren. They won't be able to buy a home on a high school education. They're going to have their incomes in their working years limited by the support of their elder population. And their after-tax incomes are not going to grow as fast as they did for our generation. And they're going to have a harder time achieving the American dream in the 21st century than my generation did in the 20th. But I started my comments with a quote from Kierkegaard. I hope I got it in, that we live lives looking forward, but we understand our lives looking backward. And at the end of my lecture, I would quote from Hegel, "The owl of Minerva flies only at the dusk. Wisdom occurs only at the end of the day." So those are my comments, and I look forward to your questions, and I'm sorry we're not across the table from one another. Evan?
Thank you very much, Professor Bjork. This was a fantastic first lecture. I can't believe it's your first on Zoom. You should do these more often. If anyone has a question, you can feel free to put it in the chat. You can also virtually raise your hand in the participant section. The first question I have comes from someone asking about the stimulus programs that have recently been released, and of course those that may come in the coming months ahead. How are we going to pay for all the stimulus programs that have and continue to pass to help our economy recover from COVID, as well as other programs expected in the Biden administration? When will the US pay that bill? Will inflation come roaring back as a result of these programs?
Well, that's a very tough question. I had two parts. First of all, the stimulus program is standard Keynesian economics to try to increase incomes, to increase employment. The problem is that the decrease in employment, which we've observed during the pandemic, isn't lack of people's ability to spend. It's because the industries where they're working have been closed down by the COVID. And one of the problems with the current stimulus bill is that it is sending a big stimulus to everybody. It needs to be sent to the people who need it because they are out of work. And the second part of the question is, how are we going to pay for it? Well, we're going to print the money to pay for it. That's modern monetary theory. And the answer of the monetary theorists is, when inflation starts, then you just raise taxes to get all the money out of circulation. Nobody knows how it's going to end, but I'm afraid badly.
We had a few questions come in about education, Professor Bjork. One of them specifically about what will it take to build an education system that works for the 21st century? And another question came in about the cost of education as it relates to not only tuition, but even books. You look at some academic books that cost $100, $200, $300 each. So some comments about how we build a strong future for higher education in America and how we address the expense.
That's a very difficult question. If we had a simple answer, we would have put it into effect by now. Part of it is going to depend upon educational technology, but a much larger part is going to be motivation, which starts in the home and starts with children looking at their parents' situation. I don't know, those of you who are parents, what your experience has been, but I know that when our children were in grade school and high school, we helped them with their languages and their math, and we valued education. A lot of American parents now may not have the ability or the time to do that. So part of the problems start in the home, which is an important part of the educational process. The costs of education have increased because people are taking more of it. The cost of education has increased because we're putting more resources into it. And in fact, there are some very gloomy studies which have been done by respectable economists, which indicate that the rate of return, if you want to look at education in those terms, is not very economic for a substantial part of the population. More resources are being spent on their education than they get back in terms of higher incomes. So that doesn't answer all the questions. I hope somebody can answer them.
Thank you. We have an alumnus who remembers a talk you gave about 20 years ago, give or take, when you observed that immigration and the productivity that immigrants added in the 1990s led to a growing economy. What role do you see immigrants and immigrant policy going forward on the American dream, net positive or creating more challenges?
Well, this is a very big and difficult question, Evan. Two things. First of all, if immigrants come in and join the labor force and in particular are in well-paying jobs, or there's a complementarity which allows others to take high-paying jobs, they can increase GDP and the tax base. The problem is that if immigrants are dependent on the working population, and particularly if they get Medicare and education as part of the social safety net, part of the social contract, those costs are large to the taxpayer. In the state of California, $12,000 a year from the state. Take a family that's got 2 children, that's $24,000 a year for education. If they don't have employer-paid medical care, they probably got another $25,000 in medical costs. So you've got $50,000 in cost to the state to be funded through the taxpayer. And how much are the immigrants paying in taxes? So that is the narrow way to look at it. It's a very difficult problem. There are 2 countries which have very different educational, very different immigration systems than ours. The Canadian system and the Australian system, where they evaluate immigrants in terms of their immediate potential to contribute to the labor force. We don't do that. We have a variety of other ways of approaching immigration.
Catherine in the chat mentioned that women and the women of color specifically were hit very hard during this most recent economic downturn and the challenges with COVID. How will recovery work, in your opinion, for women who have borne the brunt of job loss and caregiving duties because of the pandemic?
Well, you really need to see increased equality in wages in labor markets for this. And I looked at the recent data, and there's reasonable equality between people of color and whites for the bottom half of the population. The differences in compensation come in the higher half of the population. But we need measures to increase the labor income of the lower part of the population. In my opinion, the most effective way to do this probably is the earned income tax credit, which incentivizes increased participation in the labor force. I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan Medina, also a PPEer, has long been a proponent of STEM education and technology, and follows the technology sector very closely. He sees that for clients, that about 90% of their talent comes from overseas technical universities. Do you see America ever greatly expanding its STEM education to provide a better future for our country, as well as sectors seem to be greatly affected by technological progress?
Well, first of all, you need to start the basis for technical education in grade school and high school. People need to be able to read and write and calculate. One of my tennis buddies who taught in the LA public schools talked about how ridiculous it was to make people from lower income families pass the algebra test to continue on past 8th grade in the LA public school system, and how that had the effect of discouraging a lot of people who were behind on their learning curve and led to them dropping out. But you need to improve the process there. I'm very pleased to see 2 things happening at CMC. First of all, the integration of data sciences with other disciplines, biology, chemistry, economics. Great idea. And of course, we've been doing that on an informal basis for 30 years, but this is just going to accelerate it. And the other thing, which I think is very important, is the Saul Center emphasis on internships. Because if students can get into a job where they see the kinds of technology they're going to have to use, they'll get it.
Thank you, Professor Bjork. If you were advising our soon-to-be president, what would you recommend he do to revive the economy in the short term and to address the long-term structural economic problems you discussed?
Well, tough question. I'm tempted to say that when I was a young professor at Columbia University, I was asked to join Nixon's economic team, and I declined because I wanted to stay in academia. So the chairman of that said, well, I'll get somebody else. The person he got was Alan Greenspan. So that could have been my career, but I'm always glad that I stayed in academia. What would I tell Biden? First of all, we need to improve the education and job market for the lower income population. We need earned income tax credits. The universal stimulus program is very wasteful. You should target it much more. Probably a big public works program, if it wasn't pork barrel, would be a good idea. But another thing I would point out, this wasn't directly part of the question, and it isn't really up to the national government. I haven't crunched the numbers on this. I'd love to do it. I think that one of the big causes of the increase in income inequality in the United States over the last 40 years has been the zoning and building regulations, which we have as a continue on from the 1920s when zoning was the big deal. And this has essentially decreased the supply of available land and the intensity of its use for building and driven up urban rents. And since the urban property is largely owned by people in the upper half of the income distribution, it has increased their income through owner-occupied costs. I could give some examples of this, but in my 1980 book, The Life, Liberty, and Property, the Economics and Politics of Land Use Planning, I noted that that was what one of the effects of restrictions on intensive urban growth would be, and that it would increase income inequality. In the state of California, the legislature has tried to get high-rise apartments near to transport corridors, and it has been vigorously resisted by local groups and local governments who have stopped it from happening. The triumph of the NIMBYs.
We had an alumnus post to me directly asking a little bit more about your comment on science and CMC's integrated science plans. Professor Bjork, I'm trying to structure this appropriately based on the comment, how do you see integrated science improving kind of CMC's core mission of econ and international affairs and politics?
Well, you know, economics over the last 100 years has been completely transformed by computing power. When I was in graduate school, I did regressions with a handheld, mechanical calculating machine. I didn't even have one of those handheld calculators. Every bit of the calculations had to be done by hand. When I started my last book in 1990, I had to dig out all of the census data for 100 years from the original data. It was only in the last couple of years that I could get it online, integrate it directly into the Excel spreadsheets. So my kind of economics starts out with students looking up the data, seeing what the data is, trying to make some sense out of it. One of the lectures you're going to have in this series from Raj, last name, Harvard prof, Chetty, has completely transformed economics at Harvard. Instead of having an Econ 50 type approach where you have supply and demand curves and simultaneous equations, he gives the students huge data sheets and tells them, make sense out of what's going on here. And I think that that is the approach to science that we need. particularly in economics.
Scott Torrey, fellow PPEer, says hi to you and Susan. Great to see you. Great first lecture. And specifically asked, asked if they called you to lead the Fed yet. And it sounds like you had that opportunity with Nixon. But he wanted to say hello. We have a question from Maureen. Deloitte published a report talking about a shift over time from a hands-based economy to a head-based, knowledge-based economy to now a heart-based service and creative economy. How do you see this heart-based economy impacting labor productivity and productivity growth?
Well, that's a very good question. It sounds like it comes from Mo Breeze in Colorado. And I also wanted to say, hi, Scott. And Scott is one of the people who has a son in the PPE program at CMC anyway. And it's so neat to see so many alumni sons and daughters who are in the current CMC student population. But yes, empathy has got to be very important in the modern economy, particularly since it is so important in education and healthcare. And attempts to improve people's empathetic skills in education will be a very important part of improving labor markets. You know, one of the things that was said about Teddy Roosevelt was he didn't have a high IQ, but he had a very high EQ, emotional intelligence quotient, because he was able to resonate with people and understand and communicate effectively to them.
Talk to us a little bit about minimum wage. Specifically here from Jeff Mason talking about a $15 per hour national minimum wage. Would that increase economic equality? And would that be at the cost of a net decrease in gross national product?
Well, the traditional view of economists, and I probably taught this to you in Econ 50, was that minimum wages, which were too high, would cost employment. There's been a lot of empirical research done on this over the last 30 years and indicates that modest increases in the minimum wage do not cause unemployment. I think there's some evidence from the research on the Seattle economy where modest increases didn't have much effect, but when those increases got larger, they did start to have some effect on employment. I think that a better approach is the earned income tax credit than the minimum wage, but I do think that we should have a raise in the national minimum wage. Maybe not to $15 immediately, and I would leave it much more up to the states because there's a tremendous difference in wage levels in different employment markets. And just as an aside on this, I was lecturing to a senior group a year ago, and I pointed out that the cost of living index for seniors in Little Rock, Arkansas was 75 on the national average of 100, and it was 150 in Santa Barbara, twice as much. So I said, why aren't we all moving to Little Rock, Arkansas from Santa Barbara in order to double our standard of living? None of them wanted to go.
What is, along that vein, Gordon, what is your stance on a universal basic income and its feasibility in abating income inequality?
It's a very interesting idea. And the intellectual basis from that should be that productivity and income in our society is generated socially from decades of knowledge and capital, and all of the population should be able to share in that. Now, it's currently shared through our educational system, through our healthcare system, but it might make sense to change our system of supporting people who are unemployed or on low incomes with a grant. George McGovern proposed this in 1972, a demo grant. Andrew Yang has proposed it in the last election. The problem with this probably is that you don't want it to be set at a level which will discourage participation in the labor force. And I have seen instances where the transfer programs available to low or moderate income people operate to keep them from going back into the labor force.
We had a question come in.
You want to have people participating in the labor force and paying taxes.
Thank you. We had a question from Jim Teeter specifically about California Proposition 19. Professor Bjork, are you familiar with Prop 19 and its potential effects on California real estate?
Yes, I am. And I think that the current Prop 13, which passed when I was at CMC, had some very useful effects in restraining the growth of local spending. But it probably has outlived its usefulness in its present form. It has certainly contributed to income inequality, and it certainly is not fair for two properties which are side by side with people with similar situations to be paying very substantially different amounts of taxes because of the date that they bought their property. And particularly, I would say, yes, put it on commercial property by all means. But all of this is tied up with my hunch, and I haven't crunched the data yet, that a significant part of the increase in inequality over the last 40 years has come from the increase in property income. And a lot of people don't realize that the implicit rents from owner-occupied services is counted as part of people's income.
We had a question about your economic perspective on the impact of lockdowns and how the shutdowns may create longer-term structural impacts on small business, particularly in hard-hit industries.
Well, of course, small business is undergoing a huge revolution because of the impact of supply chain management. I remember a senior thesis that I supervised in probably 1979 or 80, where people were able to do their banking on their telephone. And another one, which was looking at the impact on grocery stores of the scanners. CMC students were thinking about that then. One of the large increases in productivity that the economy had during the 1990s reflected the fact that Walmart and Kmart, Costco, and particularly Amazon drove a lot of retail mom and pop shops out of business and increased productivity. I've just remembered, Evan, I want my wife to say hello to all of the people who are in the audience.
Sounds good.
So hello. This is really a nice experience for us both.
We're so glad you both could be here.
Anytime you're in Santa Barbara, give us a call.
And that reminds me, to all of the people who are just listening, I still have my CMC email. It's gbjork, lowercase, no spaces, no periods, just gbjork@cmc.edu. And if any of you want to get in touch, I'd be glad to hear from you. I'll send you a copy of my comments today. I'm going to send one to the alumni office as well for them to send on to people if they want it.
Thank you, Professor Bjork. Maybe as a final comment, what might your next book be about if you plan to write another one?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I retired, I had planned to keep my book up to date. And I found out that for a variety of reasons, the Bureau of Economic Analysis had changed the way they did price indices and quantity indices and all kinds of other elements which are used to report and record economic data. And in order to bring out a second edition of the book, which reflected the 2000 census, I'd have to go back and redo 100 years of data with the current conventions. So I decided that in my retirement, having given 42 years to teaching college students, that I would try to mentor grandchildren. And Susan and I have mentored 8 grandchildren who are all doing very well. And I'm very proud of that. I've also given a lot of lectures to senior groups on economics. My wife keeps telling me I should write more books, but part of it is I find if I sit at the computer and crunch numbers, I get a headache in 2 hours.
We look forward to continuing conversation and hope to have you back either virtually or of course in person at our next alumni weekend, or perhaps a special 75th event as we celebrate CMC's 75th anniversary in the near future. Hope to see many of you at our future programs. 4 o'clock on Thursday, we have Zach Weissman talking about finding your passion, and Professor Pitney at noon on Friday talking about politics and Biden's first 100 days. Reminder that we have all of these recorded and they are on our virtual library on the alumni and parents sections of the website. Professor Bjork, a big thank you for being with us today. And thanks to all of you for taking the hour out of your day and spending it with CMC. Have a great night and be well. Gordon?
Thank you very much, Alumni Office, for setting it up.